So, how do you begin to introduce a legend? Well, you start by looking at the official version, which is in your conference handbook, and then you trawl the internet and look for the less public, visible signs of the man. He wasn't expecting this. So let's go a little to the underbelly of the legend. Lee Shulman. He was born and raised in Chicago, the only son of Jewish immigrants who owned a small delicatessen called the Logan Delicatessen. These early experiences in the deli led to a profound appreciation of pastrami and the well-marbled life. We shall talk about that over lunch, right? After graduating high school, Lee won a scholarship to the University of Chicago, where he studied philosophy and psychology. He then entered the Department of Education and studied with Benjamin Bloom and Joseph Schwab, among others. He was particularly influenced by Schwab's work on the structure of different disciplines, which later resurfaced in his work on teacher knowledge. His early introduction to disciplinary knowledge has been a consistent thread throughout his academic career. His first academic job was with the College of Education at Michigan State University. And never content to stay within departmental boundaries, Lee collaborated with a colleague in the medical school, Arthur Elstein, which many of you I think know, who also happened to have been Lee's college roommate and best man. Judy, you didn't tell us this. This collaboration led to a study of medical decision-making among expert diagnosticians, medical problem solving. Two themes from his book have continued to resonate throughout Shulman's career. The first, focus on cognition in the professoriate, particularly under conditions of uncertainty, and two, the domain specificity of expertise. Says Shulman, the challenge is to get inside the heads of practitioners, to see the world as they see it. To see the world as they see it. Then to understand the manner in which experts construct their problem spaces, their definitions of the situation, thus permitting them to act as they do. It's quite profound, I think. In '82, Shulman moved to Stanford University School of Education. It was in his early years at Stanford that he engaged in the research and that yielded the conception of pedagogic content knowledge, the idea that launched a new stage of research in teaching and teacher education. During his tenure at Stanford University, he also served as president of the American Research Association and the National Academy of Education. Says Shulman again, within the category of pedagogic content knowledge, I include, for the most regularly taught topics in one subject area, the most useful form of representation of those areas, of those ideas, the most powerful analogies, illustrations, examples, explanations, and demonstrations. In a word, the ways of representing and formulating the subject that make it comprehensible to others. There's quite a lot in that, eh? Demystifying the notion of scholarship as being highly theoretical. In fact, it's preeminently practical. Lee Shulman spent much of his professional life advocating for the importance of teaching at all levels, from kindergarten through graduate school. He is best known for his work on the construct of pedagogical content knowledge, and continues to inspire scholars around the world. He certainly inspires me in my recent work on pedagogic content knowledge in the context of interdisciplinarity. So Lee, didn't think there was anything that embarrassed you there. I left the juicy bits out, actually. So Lee, if we could, so the session is going to be somewhat different than it's typically done. People have come here to listen to you. So we will give you the benefit of a fairly lengthy input session, possibly 40 to 50 minutes. And should there be time thereafter, then we'll have a question and answer discussion session. But to let you know that hereafter, in the early afternoon session, Lee will be in a workshop session, which is essentially a continuation of the discussions here. So you could have your far more in-depth discussions on issues of concern to you if you choose to attend Lee's session after lunch. With that, enjoy.
After an invitation like that, I think the traditional act is then to bury the body rather than... But I'll remain upstanding for a bit longer. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for that exciting account of what are indeed a revolutionary set of changes in higher education. People have said for many, many decades that changing a university is as difficult as moving a cemetery. You're moving the cemetery. My title for this morning's comments, I want to call attention to several aspects of the title because I worked rather assiduously in framing it. Situating a scholarship of teaching, well, first of all, between research and practice. We tend often to think about research or theory and practice as representing a chasm of enormous, enormous depth and breadth. And yet it's no accident that the, thank you, that the book that I'm proudest of is a book titled The Wisdom of Practice. Because in my view, it is practice that is the fountain of understanding from which wisdom derives and to which wisdom ultimately returns. And that what the Vice Chancellor has described, what so many of you are here for, is to render both the priority order in reverse, but also to imagine an academy in which research and practice are seen as almost Siamese twins, as siblings that one cannot imagine separating without rendering the vitality of each very, very dangerous. But I also want to focus on a scholarship of teaching and learning within the professional, intellectual, and moral landscape of the academy. Yes, the academy is a place for thought. Imagine an institution that has a place everywhere in the world where people are paid to think. I mean, just think, it's really quite extraordinary. But the thinking, even though I've always thought that it's thought for itself, to its own end, I've come increasingly to view as in the service of our professing and our moral and civic action. And that unless the academy becomes, and the scholarship in the academy becomes, a site for intellectual and moral and professional, in the broadest sense of thinking about a professional as someone who is given autonomy in exchange for a commitment to serve humanity around it. That's what a professional is. That's what it means for us as teachers to profess. That is why we engage in a scholarship of teaching and learning. Now, Rubby has already quite comprehensively talked about my own journey. But I think it's very difficult to understand how someone got somewhere without having some sense of the travel they did before it. Now, this will seem like a long journey, and indeed it has been. While still in your country, a week from tomorrow, I will celebrate my 78th birthday. And so, I hope I'm not done yet. Oh, I must say, a number of years ago, I received something called the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association of Colleges for Teacher Education in the United States, and it seemed somewhat fatal in its title, and I simply wanted to add, so far. But in any event, as Rubby said, I started as a student wondering about philosophy and epistemology. What troubled me is, how does anybody learn anything new? I mean, it's hard work, and how does it happen? And I moved to becoming a psychologist, focusing on the psychology of teaching and learning. And there are several things that are dangerous about being even a good psychologist. And it's taken me many of the ensuing years to learn it. One is, psychologists are just wonderful at thinking about the minds of people. And it took me many, many years to realize that their hearts are just as important. That while the mind is extraordinarily important, exciting to study and to learn and to use, there's more to it than the mind. But in my journey, I began with studying the minds of teachers. How do teachers make decisions, solve problems, invent things, the sort of things we all do on a daily basis? I spent 10 years studying the minds of doctors, quite by accident. At Michigan State University, we started a new medical school that we'd never had, and a guy came over who said he was the dean of the medical school. He said, "Shulman, you study how people think, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, that's what we're trying to teach doctors to do, and that's a much too hard a job for other doctors to figure out. How about spending some time figuring out what we do when we think?" Two lessons there. One, don't be afraid to cross disciplinary boundaries. To all the vice chancellors, celebrate joint appointments. I have always had joint appointments. Professor of Educational Psychology and Medical Education. Professor of Teacher Education and the Department of Psychology. I mean, always. I've come back to Stanford now in my 70s, and I'm Professor of Education and Religious Studies. Jewish Studies, in my case. Anyone who wants to play around with some biblical Hebrew during the break, I'm all for it. But the point is, we inseminate one another when we stretch out into these dangerous zones. Reward it, don't punish it. I moved then from the minds of doctors as general diagnosticians to recognizing that medical diagnostic skill is indeed domain specific. If you choose to go to a neurologist for your headache, you're going to get a neurological diagnosis, folks, even if the source of your problem is somewhat below your abdomen. I don't want you thinking like that. There's lots of stuff below the admin. There are a couple out on that quadrant who are, yeah, you too, Nana, watch out. But anyway, I don't want to go through this whole journey with you, except to make one particular point. I began as a very well-trained University of Chicago educational psychologist. Benjamin Bloom was an extraordinary resource. He became a second father because my father died the year before I began working with Bloom as a graduate student. He taught me a lesson about methodology. You can do anything you want with your data, anything, as long as you are fully transparent to the field about what you did, how you did it, and when you did it. Don't let somebody else's rules stymie your creativity as a scholar. But as a member of the community, you must be totally honest and open about what you've done and how you did it. Very simple lesson. Ben Bloom, when I was about 21 years old. The notion, as I said, of moving from studying pedagogical solitude to community property. Very important. Our research, however brilliant, whether it's in a traditional research domain or as part of SOTL, is almost worthless until it becomes part of the community's understanding and the community's tools for thought. And that's a very important principle. If you're doing SOTL, you must find a way to get the word out. And please, God, it's not only through refereed journals. In the coming years, some of the most important ideas that grow out of the scholarship of teaching and learning are likely to be tweeted rather than to be published in some journal. And I know you're starting journals, but figure out a way, the way the physicists have with physical letters in some of their journals, to broaden the range of ways people can input their ideas, because last year's research may not be relevant to tomorrow's challenges. In any event, after the period of the Carnegie Foundation in which we built upon the work of my predecessor, the late Ernest Boyer, and moved from the scholarship of teaching as that which we as teachers do in deeply scholarly ways to teach everything we teach, to a scholarship of teaching and learning where the ways we grow smarter through that work become part of the tool chest of our colleagues all over the world. That somehow people would say, but this SOTL work is second-class work. It can't possibly be as good as real research. I got that as I try to encourage people to move from solely quantitative to more qualitative and mixed method research. Oh, you're attenuating the rigor of the work. I found as our work got more and more into the bowels of practice, it got harder to do, more distinguished, and much more important. It's far easier in some ways to do what I did for a long time, which is retreat into a kind of laboratory setting where everything's under control and wonderful things can happen there, to entering the hurly-burly of real practice in our universities or our kindergartens, in medical rounds, which I've studied extensively, or in engineering design studios, or in law practices. That's hard to do, but that's the tradition in which SOTL has arisen. It's a continuing puzzle. There's been great practice. I come here, do you have any idea how long it took to get here? And I find a community that is doing the scholarship of teaching and learning in ways that I think exceed that of almost any university or college I know in the United States. And I am not exaggerating. And you're not done. So, I will go over this quickly now because it would take an entire seminar to do it, and maybe we'll talk about some of it in the conversation hour. But it's the importance of recognizing that a scholar of teaching, all of you out here, are developing habits of mind, ways of thinking about your work, habits of practice, ways of doing things more skillfully, and habits of the heart, and a sense of emotional commitment to values, to civic engagement, to empathy. When a student makes an error, not why are they wrong and how can I correct it, but what must be going on in their heads to make that seem like a reasonable response to the situation. Because it may turn out to be something that expands your sense. And in dealing now with the intersection of education and religion, I see higher education as a site where habits of the heart include finding ways for people to retain their own personal and community faith without having to impugn the right of others to pursue theirs. That's the ultimate kind of pluralism that the religion-based wars in our world are making it very difficult to achieve. But that's something for higher ed, a kind of interdisciplinarity that I'm sure you have in mind. So let me ask you, as we think about SOTL, let's try to use some different senses to think about SOTL. Let's try to get a little bit less analytic. So let me ask you, what does the scholarship of teaching and learning sound like? This is the scholarship of teaching and learning. What happens to this work of a single individual? Another voice. Sometimes we don't finish the job, we just run out of time. But we've listened to it. We'll listen some more in a few minutes. But what does the scholarship of teaching look like? And I'm sure you're thinking of pages of journals, of reports, of something I love dearly, portfolios. I spent years working on portfolio-based assessment. But let me ask you to think about what the scholarship of teaching looks like this way. One door, previously dark, now with some light on it. I hope you're puzzled. But what might a fully mature scholarship of teaching look like? Welcome to the illuminated landscape of Durban. And note that in the illuminated landscape, there are still plenty of dark places. So, how do we think about the challenges of the scholarship of teaching and learning? I think the challenges to the scholarship of teaching and learning grow out of our laments. Teaching may not be the most difficult job anyone has ever created, but as I said once to a conference of physicians that I was addressing, the only time medicine even approaches the difficulty of an average day of teaching in the 3rd grade is an emergency room during a national disaster. So, but what do we do as teachers? With my apologies to Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. All is vanity. Everything is meaningless. Generations come and generations go, but education remains the same. The sun rises, the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. All the rivers flow into the sea, and the sea is never full. There's nothing new under the sun. Or have we simply failed to learn? No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. And this is the one that kills me, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Well, haven't you sometimes felt that way? I wish I hadn't known that. Or students who have their consciousness raised because we've taught in a really effective decolonizing, consciousness-raising manner are now much smarter about the world and much less happy about it at the same time. So what's our challenge? What ails the academy? And my years in medicine have taught me to think about the ailments of the academy as pathologies. These are the pathologies we in the scholarship of teaching and learning are trying to overcome, so the lament about nothing ever changes and nobody remembers can be somehow attenuated. Our first disease is amnesia. I mean, think about it. Pedagogical amnesia is rampant. We act, we learn, and we forget. And it's not just that our colleagues don't forget. How much do you really remember, if you didn't carefully document it and analyze it, of this terrific course you taught 3 years ago? Or 10 years ago? If it had been research, you could go back to the journal and find it. But pedagogical amnesia is epidemic. So that's one pathology. The second pathology is phantasia. And I don't mean the old Disney movie. Phantasia is where you do, in fact, think you remember something, but you misconstrue it, you misremember it. And we know that experience in our daily lives, where you tell a story based on something that you thought happened in point X, and it actually happened at point and time Y, with different people under, well, maybe I'm older than you, you don't suffer those, but I see a couple over there who probably do. And there are about 14 people in the room who think I was pointing at them and nodding. The third is solitaria, and that is we do learn something important and we keep it to ourselves. We keep it to ourselves. Can you imagine if the fellow who first invented the polio vaccine said, God, that's a good thing. I think I'll put it in my drawer. Well, we as teachers do very similar things. How much stuff is in our drawers? Inertia. Newton's first law, for those of you in physics. Bodies in motion stay in motion. Bodies at rest stay at rest. Change is very, very difficult. And so our ideas remain inert. Our practices remain inert. And we often justify all of that with the last of the pedagopathologies, nostalgia. Back when I was in school, these new approaches to the teaching of mathematics must be crazy. I mean, look how well I know my multiplication tables. And so the question is, how can SOTL combat these diseases? And I would split the word into dis-eases, these things that make our ease somewhat less comfortable. Well, the benefits of a scholarship of teaching and learning are we should learn from studying our practice, and the difficulties of our practice and where it works and where it doesn't. We should learn stuff that ultimately benefits the learning and development of our students, that it should benefit the learning and development of our teachers. The scholarship of teaching and learning is the most powerful form of professional development for teachers I know. It beats bringing in somebody from California to give a speech. Engage in this kind of work individually, collectively, communally. It benefits the work of programs, of universities. It recenters the idea of research around its implications for society. And if SOTL is done well, it contributes to the creation of academic communities of excellence and moral responsibility and the end of isolation. I don't know what your buildings look like, where your faculty sit, but my office at Stanford, I have the door open all the time. You can do that when you're professor emeritus. And I have an espresso coffee machine where anyone who wants a cup can come in and join me. And so many of the offices of my colleagues are either closed door or empty because they're off writing or they're off doing something else. And it's by and large the case, and it's probably true with you, most of us as faculty know more about a colleague in a university's work 1,000 miles away than we know about what the person next door is doing. That's a community of scholars. Scholarship of teaching and learning begins to change that. It begins to make people allies. It takes a community of scholars. So let's go back to the sounds of SOTL again. Now, SOTL begins with a theme. It's the product of our pedagogical imaginations. It begins to play out, and then different voices are added to it as we try it out in a different way, or as a colleague tries it in a different way. And when it's really working, try it a different way. Those lessons. So notice that it starts simply, that it moves ahead, but it iterates. Iteration is the hallmark of a scholarship of teaching and learning because we never get it right the first time. If we do, it's because we aren't watching very carefully, very seriously. And so the notion of the fugue, which I love, is you get the theme. You don't lose the theme, the fundamental theme, but it reappears in different registers, different keys, different organization, but you keep the different iterations in connection with one another. So while they're different as they move this way from left to right, they're always in harmony at any given moment because they're talking to one another and they're listening. Now, you can do this with a different program. So, big question, and it's really the one I want to devote the last few minutes of this talk to. What do we mean when we call something scholarship? And I would say what we mean is that we are prepared to make a claim, make an assertion, say, this is the way a piece of the world works. Or even, this is the way it worked yesterday. Not this is the way it works all the time. And if we are engaged in scholarship, and I make such a claim to Rubby, he, being a good colleague, will say, how do you know? Why should I believe you? What kind of evidence can you bring forward to support that? Now, the evidence can be of a very different set of types. I can make the claim, I have learned that I will never buy a Ford motor car. And Rubby says to me, what's the evidence that supports that? Well, the answer to that question can legitimately be, I read an engineering study in which 15,000 Fords were tested in this way, and these were the scores of that study. Or I can say, my brother-in-law had a Ford, and it was really a stinker. Well, now imagine yourself ready to buy a car, and you've got those two kinds of evidence. On what basis are you going to buy the car? It's not an easy call, especially if your brother lives a block away, and the car that you're buying would have to face the same potholes in the roads, and, just think about. But there has to be some kind of evidence, and the evidence has to be publicly available and therefore subject to critical analysis. That's what scholarship is. It isn't something that Harry Potter does under his cloak of invisibility. Hang up the cloak. Evidence. Now, how does evidence provide a basis for understanding? And one of the misconceptions, I think, that is broad is that scholarship of teaching is all about techniques of teaching, the design of a course, and that the results of the scholarship of teaching are, I designed a course this way, I taught it this way, here's how the students did, therefore, here's what you can learn from my experience. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Perfectly reasonable. Very often we say, and this is why I think it worked that way. So even though it was a single course, you have a theory of the case. And our species theorizes. We not only tell stories, we try to get lessons from the stories. My wife, Judy, who's sitting in the front row holding up papers to show me how much time I've got left. 55 years of marriage, there's a certain set of responsibilities that get divided. Now, she's quite up to it. About 15 years ago, she won the American Educational Research Association Award for research that relates theory to practice. So Judy is keeping my theories practical. But, for example, one of the most powerful pieces of research, at least for teachers that I've worked with, was work done by Professor Mary Budd Rowe in science education on a phenomenon called wait time. How many of you are familiar with that notion of wait time? Few of you are. What she studied was that when teachers are doing lessons where there are lots of questions and answers going back, that if the teacher asks a question and requires there to be 4 or 5 seconds of silence before anyone answers, or when a kid answers, doesn't let other kids jump in and doesn't jump in herself, but leaves for, is that practice of wait time. So it's not what teachers do, but it's they refrain from doing. Shut up, teacher. And shut up all those other kids who want to jump in. If you use Bloom's taxonomy, the level of thinking goes up. That those time and wait time contributes to the elevation. Now, I would say two things. That's an extraordinarily powerful finding. I would also say that I'm not prepared to generalize it from fourth grade classrooms in science to all other classrooms. That doesn't make that finding less valuable. In fact, I would argue that every piece of research anyone does has to first be viewed as something that was situated in a particular place at a particular time, where they're doing a classic experiment with all the methodological bells and whistles and precautions, or whether they try it out in their classroom on a given day. One of the great illusions that we have about research is good research is research that generalizes across all situations. That is the illusion that I find very dangerous. And I'll tell you exactly the moment when I realized its danger. I was reading a long article in the Sunday New York Times about an ostensibly failed clinical trial in cancer chemotherapy. There was a very, very deadly brain cancer. And someone came up with a drug, a chemotherapy, that would attack that brain cancer. It's called glioblastomas. And they did it with thousands of clinical subjects, and the conclusion was it doesn't make a difference. Well, they looked at the data carefully. It didn't make a difference overall, but there was about 10% of the patients in the trial who were cured dramatically, and there was no remission, there was no return. Well, if you looked at everything and tried to make a gross generalization, there was no difference. But if you began to unpack the data and say, just a second, for whom did it work? For whom did it harm? For whom? Were there differences in these clusters? It turned out that there were extraordinary differences in those clusters. And as we now know about cancer chemotherapy, the very same agent can be extraordinarily therapeutic for people with certain kinds of DNA or whatever, and that's true for education as well. In fact, I believe that we have to treat all research as situated. That it is dangerous to say, this technique worked at Stanford in the teaching of physics, now we can use it to teach physics in Durban. Look, it may not be a bad starting point. It may be, okay, da-da-da-da-da, bum, bum, bum. Let me try that as my first theme, but let me be prepared to change the theme to watch what happens and adapt. Generalization is insidious if you believe that as a first principle. I believe that you begin respecting the local character of any scholarship we do, whether it's on pedagogical content knowledge, medical problem solving, or wait time. But what did her research on wait time do? For the next 10 years, as the work on wait time became distributed among the teaching profession, K-12 in the United States, teachers began talking to one another about how they were using silence in the classroom. It had opened their minds to think about time and the way you orchestrate time in your classroom as one of the tools that you have as a pedagogue. So I would say that very often our scholarship of teaching does not simply teach us about techniques. It opens up our field of vision. And indeed, I won't talk about a few of these others, but my view of what we do in the scholarship of teaching is every study we do is like a point of light. I'm going to go back to that in a second. It's like this. Its value is that where we were in total darkness about a particular phenomenon in education or in the teaching of literature or whatever, somebody has done a piece of work that helps us understand that there are ways of teaching Shakespeare that look seriously at Shakespeare as a man's view of women, and that if you look at it from a woman's view, the very same play looks like a very different piece of drama. For example, how do we get from that one? Well, we've got to start not being like, this is the, how many of you know the story of the drunk who loses his keys, and a policeman sees him and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I lost my keys and I'm trying to find them." He said, "Where'd you lose them?" He said, "I lost them over there where it's, in that dark field." He said, "Well, why don't you go look for it there?" He said, "You crazy man, it's dark there." Well, when all we've got is a single study, we're like that drunk. We go to that study and say, okay, Shulman did that study at Stanford in 1999. I guess that's a good... It's one study, and you've got to ask, who were the students? What was going on? And very often, my sin will have been that when I published that study, I didn't give you enough information. I didn't tell you enough about the situation and the students and the context, which means that when we do this kind of study, it's wonderful to do that study, but you've got to put a lot more light around that door. Who's shining the light, for goodness sake? And about intentions and everything, because without it, other people can't make those claims. So instead of being like the drunk, I imagine landscapes of evidence. I'm imagining that, that is Durban, isn't it? No? Oh, in that case, it's Taipei, where I once gave this talk. It also tends to be humid. The point is, you have landscapes where each light is small. But if you've got enough points of light, you begin to find your way, even through darkness, because, okay, you can orient yourself, and then if you do another piece of work, another light shines. And I see the goal of the scholarship of teaching, aggregating those points of light into landscapes of evidence. And I don't know how to represent it here, but that darkness is not just places nobody has explored. What's really important, I can't read it, Judy, it's too faint. Oh, thank you. That there are points of light that are simply dark because they've not been explored. In many ways, far more important are points that indicate something has tried and failed. One of the sins of all of our research publication is we are told, don't publish negative results. The reason fields like medicine have flourished is because they have entire conferences built around, here's what I tried and I screwed it up. This surgery doesn't work. And if the journals don't accept that kind of work, well, a lot more of us are going to die on the operating table. Or a lot of students are going to fail to learn. Even Cape Town can look like a landscape of evidence. I found that. Now tell me that's not Cape Town. Well, what I like about that, and I'm not going to get to Cape Town for a week or so, is the notion that when people are working together, those individual points of light can serve as a pathway. Even though any one research group or person only contributed one of the points. And finally, I think we've got to recognize that when we have an illuminated landscape. We've got light. That our greatest challenge is figuring out what's below the surface. Why are people doing what they do? What are their motivations? What aspects of culture, language, family, community are the roots of what we can now see? That's going theoretical. What's the story I can tell that explains why the world is this way? So let me suggest in conclusion what I see as the standards for judging the work we do in our scholarship activities. The first set have to do with truth, honesty, modesty, and empathy. We have to look at our research and say, is it reasonable? Does it make sense? Is there evidence that I can bring to bear to support my view? Am I open to being wrong? You've got to be refutable. If you're making claims that no one can even argue against, no evidence will weaken your claim, then you've got a problem as a scholar. At the same time, what that means is you have to have what I call epistemic empathy. By that I mean that if Brenda is arguing something that I don't think is right, I have to have the habit of mind that says, I'm arguing with a very gifted person. I've got to listen carefully because I might be wrong. I mean, that's a habit of mind. How do you teach for that? How do you measure whether it's happening? How you document it? How do you build it into the orientation you have of your faculty? A second is that your work should be fun. There's got to be joy and beauty. I want people to show me some work they've done, and I want to say, God, that's neat. I wish I had done that. That's really clever. But it's not just that it helps. Boy, that helps me think about stuff I'd never thought about. It's like listening to a Bach fugue and having it teach me something else. There's also a certain simplicity. If the work you've done takes longer to explain it to others than it did to conduct it, well, one of our grandsons put something up on his Facebook page is, you've really got a problem if I have to explain to you why the punchline of the joke you just told me is funny. But also surprise. I think that we should hope for, dream of, search for research that will surprise us, that will give ourselves, because if it does, it helps us understand that we didn't set something up so that it happens the way we expect it to happen. I still remember when we began the work on medicine, on medical decision-making, the first very famous physician that we studied, and I won't go into the methodology of our studies, it was very clear that instead of methodically doing his work, within 30 seconds of seeing the patient, he had 3 diagnoses in mind. We thought, God, that's bad medicine. You're supposed to clinically collect all the data you need. And so we said, okay, we've got an anomaly. We started studying the second great physician, and the third, and the fourth. They were all doing the same damn thing. It was only then, and this was one of the great findings of our book on medical problem solving, that early hypothesis generation was the hallmark of the great physicians, paired with skepticism about the accuracy of the hypothesis, and then doing everything they could to disconfirm what they had intuitively seen as now, they were right more often than they were wrong, but they were both intuitive and spontaneous and improvisational and very systematically analytic and critical. And in fact, had they followed what was supposed to be the law of collect all the information you need, how the hell do you know how much you need if you don't know what you need it for? Well, it changed the face of the field of medical diagnosis. I'm very happy to say, you know, once I had really one great finding, I got out of the field so I could do something else. But the point is, it was a surprise. And it was a source of delight. It was fun because it was a surprise. I think the capacity to be surprised and for your work to be surprising should be at the heart of any scholarship, but especially the scholarship of teaching. Judy is now telling me to jump off the cliff, so I'll give you the third criterion of the standards. And this is a country like mine where this principle is incredibly important. You can study so many things. Don't study just what is convenient or likely to be surprising. Our work as scholars of teaching ought to contribute to justice. It ought to contribute to equality, to fairness, to humanity in the sense of helping, through our educational efforts, develop a more humane society. And I think it would be very lovely to sit with our colleagues here and say, of all the things we could study, whether it's chemistry or sociology or education, what kinds of questions might we highlight that will contribute to a more just education, a more just society? You know, some of my students used to say that their parents didn't want them to become just teachers. They wanted to become physicians, lawyers, big businessmen, or women. And I used to say to them, you know, just teachers means to some merely or only teachers. Think of yourself as a just teacher, as someone whose work contributes to the most important and elusive value of our societies. So this is our goal. Our goal is to have an enlightened landscape of evidence. It will be always sought. It will never be completed. The journey continues. That's where justice, surprise, joys, and insights await you. I thank you for bringing me here to join on that journey, and I wish you an enlightened journey so you can find your way around Durban. Thank you very much. I have to say, this is a man I met yesterday. Rubby is somebody who, after you've met him for 10 minutes, you feel that you've known him all your life.
Now, there's several ways to interpret that. It could be utterly boring, that you've heard him all before. But thank you, Lee, for that enlightening treatise. There is no truth in the allegation that we consulted Lee before designing the cover. Although we might have. So, Lee, I was particularly inspired by your analogy of musical interludes. And it reminds me of the work that some of us are initiating at UKZN around the intersection between the aesthetics and the intellectual, and how the academy keeps them apart and continues to separate them through its ritualized insular practice. And it's so refreshing to hear that this is a universal concern. My colleague Chats is nodding his head in affirmation. Actually, he's one of the forerunners of this work and he's looking to invite scholars who have a similar orientation. We don't exactly have time for question and answer, but there will be time for that in the extended discussion session after lunch. It's noted in your program.
I'm going to assure people they can drop in and out the one for state.
Yes, well, sorry? The slides onto the web. Yes, we will get permission from Lee, and it will be, so there's a couple of things that will go onto the web. One will be the slideshow, and in 2 days, the TNL TV session, which was recorded yesterday, that will be up. It's an hour-long discussion, a very rich discussion with 4 academics. The third thing that will go up on TNL TV is an edited version of this talk, as will be all the other talks and several other